Hello, everyone. This is Talmadge Boyd, and thank you for joining us for our most recent or our current installment of our TWG Plus webinar series. Today, we've got a really exciting topic for you. We're going to be talking about predictive modeling, and we've talked a lot about predictive modeling here in the office, and we found that it can be a little confusing for regular everyday people, and what we'd like to do is kind of lower that barrier to entry and help people understand how predictive modeling works and what the processes are around it. So we've asked our partner at College Raptor, Jeff Pierpont, to help us demystify it a little bit. And welcome, Jeff. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Hi.
Yeah. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. On the right-hand side of the screen, you're going to have a chat box, and if you have any questions during the session, go ahead and type them in, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the session. We're going to do our best to keep this session kind of short, about 30 minutes or so, and that way you can get on with your day. And without further ado, I'd like to just go ahead and get started. So, Jeff, let's go ahead and get started at the beginning. Let's say, what is predictive modeling?
Sure. Yeah. Great question. Thanks. So predictive modeling is often thought of as this really challenging, complex thing. When really it's not that big of a concept, really. It's using statistical analysis to determine what factors are most likely to enroll a student. And so basically what you do to build a predictive model is you look at data from previous enrollment cycles. So you take the students who enrolled, the students who didn't, and you try to discover what factors or what elements were significant in making the student enroll or not, right? And so really you're applying what is often done as a linear regression model, meaning you're trying to build a model that suggests, from essentially what students are more likely to enroll and which ones are least likely to enroll. So if you were to take a variable, you could say something like maybe an SAT score. So the students with higher SAT scores are more likely to enroll. A student with lower SATs less likely to enroll, right? And so the model picks out all of the various factors or variables that would contribute to a student's likelihood of enrollment and build an analytical model to say, okay, how important is this factor and how does that figure out and work with all the other factors? So essentially at the end of it, when you build it, you get an equation that says you multiply this factor, let's say SAT score, by this amount, plus this other factor, let's say maybe distance from campus to home, times this amount, and blah, blah, blah. And then you end up getting a score that tells you a student's probability of enrollment. Once you build a model on that historical data, then you can use it to apply to your current pool of students. So you take that same equation, apply it to the students who are currently in your pool, and voila, you've now got a probability of that. And then with those probabilities, then you know which students are more likely to enroll and which students are least likely to enroll. And therefore, you can start communicating with them and engaging with them in more strategic ways. So essentially, that's what you're trying to do.
And so if I had to summarize that, you're saying predictive modeling helps you focus your time, budget, and the human resources involved on the students that are most likely to enroll.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So at the end of all that math you did, essentially, you get a score for every single student. And then the higher the score, the more likely a student is to enroll or apply or whatever you built the model to do. And then you can focus your time and effort on those students more intelligently. So instead of focusing equally on all students, you can focus on the ones that have a higher probability of enrollment, therefore maximizing your returns while minimizing your time and effort. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I guess, and when you're talking about maximizing returns, you're basically focusing all of those resources, whether from email or direct mail to a counselor on the phone, which could be a high dollar in terms of time and effort, on the ones that are going to be the most likely to give you a better a better result.
Absolutely, yeah, that's 100% the case. A lot of the schools we work with, whether it be like a search campaign, the students that have a higher model score, you're going to send them more materials, or you'll spend more time-intensive projects. So you might even call students or send them more communications. As you go through the enrollment process and you get down to trying to generate applications or trying to get students to complete a FAFSA or visit campus or deposit, those are things that are much more time intensive, as you said. So really it gives your team, your counselors, a much more focused approach when it's a difference between managing hundreds and hundreds of students to focus your efforts on those that have the highest probability. So yeah.
Gotcha. So then, I guess so when we set up the this webinar, we had actually a whole bunch of people sign up and ask some questions about things that were way over my head. There were pretty detailed questions about regression analysis and how how to apply that in some cases. Now, I know your model is a little bit different. Can you explain how your approach is different from the normal linear regression model?
Sure, certainly. So at College Raptor, we do our modeling a bit differently. And so in some ways we are doing linear regression still, so we can talk about that as a point here towards the end. But let's talk a little bit more about what makes our data different. So the data we're actually analyzing to build the model a little different than what other organizations or what you might be able to do internally. So historically, most institutions have looked at their previous enrollment data to say what factors predict enrollment. Again, we use things like test scores, like SAT score, ACT score, distance from home, whether the students visited campus or not, how long were they in the inquiry pool, how long were they in the applicant pool, things like that. And they use those factors to determine, how well a student is going to fit at the school and how they score those students with a linear regression model. And so what we do differently is, first off, we take a second perspective. So if you think of all the data I just talked about, your own institutional historical data, you're looking at the students who enrolled at your school and didn't enroll at your school, right? And what makes College Raptor a little different is we add a sort of a different perspective. And so on collegeraptor.com, our student-facing college discovery website, we're helping students find colleges that are a good fit for them. And so in order to do that, we look at the information students put in, let's say test scores, GPA, intended major, location, and financial information, things like that. And then we give them what we call component scores. So we say, based on this student's test score, how well do they fit at your college? And it's not how well do they fit at your college just by itself, but it's relative to all of the other college options that student might be thinking about. So if we said a student had, let's say, a 75, let's say, academic fit, let's say, right? Well, that's 75 relative to all the other campuses that student may, or that student may be considering. So your competitor down the street, that student might have a 74 score, it might have a 54, it might have a 94. And so in some ways, we're looking at sort of, as the student thinks about enrollment, how well would they see your institution for a number of factors, things like distance, academics, finances, major, things like that. And so essentially, we take an institution's historical enrollment data, the data they already have in their system, and we append to it data from our algorithms for each of those component scores. So that gives us what we like to call a two-perspective approach, meaning we're looking at your enrollment perspective as an institution, what is your historical enrollment perspective, and from the student's perspective, how well do they see your institution? And we blend these two together to really give you a better sense or a different lens in which to look at your enrollment. And then with that data, we build regression models to determine what factors, again, are significant to predicting enrollment, and then apply those models to our current pool, or the kids that are currently in your enrollment pool. So kids that would be enrolling in fall 15 or fall 17, fall 18, things like that. In terms of the second part of that question, really about the linear regression, so currently we generally use linear regression as our primary means of building a model. However, we found that there's some challenges with that. So if you think about linear regression, the easiest way to think about that is, let's say, if you're looking at one factor, let's say a student's expected family contribution, and you find that students that have a higher ESC are more likely to enroll than students with low ESC, right? Then that's linear. So as the ESC goes up, the enrollment probability goes up, right? It's related. However, that's not always the case. One of the schools we work with, they have a very different sense of this. So they have a really high percentage of their students are Pell eligible, so low income students, and another percentage of their students that's significant are very wealthy students. So in fact, what it ends up looking like, instead of it being a straight line for enrollment and ESC being connected, really it's more of a U shape. So students that have low ESCs and students that have high ESCs have higher probabilities of enrollment, whereas students that are sort of in that middle ground of ESC are less likely to enroll. And so what we're doing right now, and we're building models with some students, actually master students at the University of Iowa, which we're in Iowa City, so it works out. So we're doing a pilot project with them right now to have nonlinear statistical models. And so we're hoping to find clustering groups. And so helping to say, okay, students that look like this cluster are more likely to enroll, and come up with equations that take that clustering into account, as opposed to trying a straight line. And so really, our approach is trying to look at it, in two ways differently. One is by what data we're putting in the model, and what perspective we use from that data. And then two, trying to find other statistical strategies, as opposed to a linear regression, which is just a statistical model. Trying to build a different approach to figure out if we could find how this clustering is impacting enrollment. And then as we do that, we're hoping we can be able to be more refined in our models and improve the likelihood of producing models that help schools out more effectively than even linear regression. So, yeah.
Nice. It's actually, I've got a lot of questions in there, but I kind of need to move on a little bit. So then, for folks who haven't added a predictive model to their search cycle yet, maybe move on a little bit. Then, so sometimes we get a little internal or barriers about I don't have the right information, or it's a philosophical approach, or some philosophical differences. But obviously, people need to bring bring predictive modeling into their search cycle at any stage of the cycle. But they want to get started. Can you kind of give folks online an idea of what to expect when you're kicking off the process of getting ready for producing a predictive model?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So when you want to build a predictive model, all you really need to do is collect data from students who've enrolled previously or not enrolled previously. So you're going to look at the last year, 2, maybe 3 years of data, and you're going to standardize that. So you're going to say, okay, let's say students that enrolled in the fall of 16, fall 15, fall 14. If you've got 3 years, that's great. And what you do is you take whatever data points you have available for those students. So if you know a student's, let's say GPA, test score, state of residency, whether they visited campus, whether they applied, whether they were admitted, whether they deposited, right? So take all the data points that you can find that have some sort of quantifiable statistic to them, right? It's hard to do something where it's, a qualitative metric. But if you can quantify it, so even if it's even like gender, you can make a column and say female and put a 1 there and 0 for men, right? And or you could say male, and do the opposite, or whatever, right, or unknown. So you can turn things into quantifiable things. So you look at those, and then all you need to do is build a regression analysis. I know that sounds like, oh, simple, just do that, right?
Yeah.
There's lots of software that you can use to do that. You can do it in something as complex as an SPSS, or there's a free tool, a free open source tool called WEKA, which is WEKA, which is actually created by a university in New Zealand. I can't remember the name right now, but they've created this thing. You can go out and search for WEKA, and it's a free download. It's a huge file. but it's a great statistical package similar to an SPSS, and it's free. And you can even do regression analysis in Excel, as long as you don't have too many data points, right? You can still do it in Excel, and it's really quite a simple function. And so really, you can do this fairly easily on your own. However, if you wanted to, get into the weeds on it and really dig in and do things, obviously it helps to have somebody with some statistical knowledge to know what factors are statistically significant or not. You don't want one piece of data, skewing your stuff and it's just, random noise. So you need someone with a little bit of, data smarts or statistical smarts to analyze it. But once you've got that model built and once you've got it sort of set, you can then start applying it to the students that are in your current pool to help determine which ones are most likely to enroll. Again, giving you the ability to refine your search communication strategies or refine your applicant strategies, your inquiry management strategies, your counselor outreach and travel, all of the above you can really do with that score. Because the whole point of this score is to find the students that are most likely to enroll. In a lot of schools, we talk to, or this philosophical point you brought up, is they'll say, well, if this model is telling me which students most likely to enroll, well, then I shouldn't bother with those kids that have really high scores because they're going to come anyway. And that's certainly a point. But at the same time, think about what your, let's say, your yield rate would be, or how well you convert a kid from a prospect name all the way through to enrolling, right? Just because a kid has a high model score relative to the rest of them, at a search stage, maybe if that kid has a 10% odds of enrolling, that's like 10 times better than the typical student in your search buy. That doesn't mean they're still likely to come. There's still a 90% chance they don't come. And so it's just helping you to focus your efforts on the kids that have the best chance, as opposed to students that are definitely going to do something. My analogy for that is often thinking about gold mines. If you've got, let's say, 10 gold mines, and in this one you know that 10% of all the rocks are gold, and the one over, on the left is 10% full of gold, and the one on the right is 1% full of gold. Well, which one are you going to spend your time mining? You put as many resources you can in that 10% gold mine as opposed to that 1% gold mine. So,
yeah, and so and talk to me a little bit about how who the stakeholders are when you get started that process, and kind of how long it takes to get started.
Yeah, generally the stakeholders involved. When we do it here, we tend to work with the enrollment management leadership team. So whether that's a VP for enrollment, director of admissions, often financial aid. We can bring in directors of financial aid. That's helpful because we find that the financial elements, the ESCs, the net price, what kind of scholarships or grant a student might be eligible for, qualify for, if they're Pell eligible or not, those often impact an enrollment decision. So getting those people at the table to say, how can we, look at the data we've had collected and build models from that. And then oftentimes in enrollment management departments, there's somebody that runs reports or manages the database that can access that data and pull it out in a very seamless way. And I tend to make good friends with that person, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And really, it's getting those people at the table to talk, not only about what you can do right now with the data that exists, because I'm certain you could build a model with the data you have already. It's about how you could make some decisions going forward about what data to collect in the future to make more valid or stronger models going further. Yeah.
And actually, that kind of segues really well with how you counsel those stakeholders on what data they need to collect, what is necessary to provide this valid results.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, really, it's whatever information you have, you can start building on and see if it shows up as statistically significant or not. But things I often tell a school when I work with them is, number one, you want some academic metrics. Everyone should universally have some data about the students that have shown interest in your school, whether you're buying them from a prospect stage, or you're buying it from SAT or College Board, or for an ACT. You can generally have an academic metric to say how academically prepared is the student for college, right? You've got that. You should have some distance information, location information, so state of residency. If you know there's zip +4, that's great because that can give you a really good distance metric between your campus and their home. So that's useful because we know distance is a very important factor. And then most importantly, you need the outcome that you're trying to measure. So the enrollment outcome. So if you're trying to measure which students are most likely to apply, which students are most likely to be admitted, which students are most likely to deposit, which students are most likely to enroll. My favorite is always to build towards enrollment because that's our ultimate metric that matters. And so what you can do is you build towards that outcome. So when you build a regression model, you need to say, what outcome am I measuring toward, and what are the variables that are trying to predict that? Well, the outcome you're measuring toward should be, did they, yes or no, binary answer, apply or not apply, enroll, not enroll, whatever. And so you need that. Beyond that, it's really whatever data you have available to start building with to see what works.
So, and I remember we were talking about this actually yesterday or the other day. You were saying that not to throw anything away.
Right.
And,
right. Yeah.
And, like you need to have a yes and a no.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the key things that I find when working with a school is that you need to know which students enrolled and which ones didn't. Right. So let's say, for example, you only had all of the data on the students that did enroll. Right. So and any student that did enroll, you just clean out your data systems or you delete things or whatever. That's really difficult. Right. If I know, the analogy I asked is, if you go up to 100 people on the street and say, which one of you people like baseball, right, or pick anything, right, and then you can say, okay, yes or no to that question. Then you can ask them other statistics, where they live, how much money they make, whether their gender, anything like that could help predict whether they like baseball or not. But if you go to a baseball game and ask people, do you like baseball? Odds are good you're not going to find a lot of differentiation. No factors are going to be predictive because everyone there likes baseball, right? And so same thing would go for a school. If you only look at data of the students who enrolled, there's no way of telling which students, what factors were important to make them enroll because we don't know the counterfactual. We need to know the data on the students that didn't enroll and that didn't apply in order to build a model successfully. And so, yeah, you need to know the true and the false for that in order to find what variables actually had significance. Yep.
Gotcha. And then now, again, talking about that, about actually gathering that data. I know people are going to want to start collecting their own. I know you've encountered a lot of clients that have gathered their own data, but it's not necessarily, let's say, clean.
Sure.
Needs to have a little tweaking. Then what data do you suggest that they, this is what they're absolutely essential data that they need to collect when they're starting to do this?
Sure. So first and foremost, I'd say start with academic data. So you're going to want to get intended major. That's often very relevant as you look at studies that say what makes a student choose a school did it have my major that I was interested in. Other things have to do with finance, which we'll get to later, but let's say major important. So start asking your students what major they're interested in when they're prospects, when they're inquiries. Find that out. It's useful. Number two, obviously those academic pieces, GPA, test scores, things like that. Get their address if humanly possible. So that tells us how far away from campus they live. It tells you whether they live in-state or out-of-state, which could impact their pricing quite dramatically. Whether it's a public institution or if you're a private college and maybe have state grants the student would be eligible for, things like that matter. Number three, if you can do high school, we find a lot of the schools we work with tend to have certain feeder high schools that are more predictive of enrollment. So if you start gathering in a standardized way what high school a student goes to, that's very helpful. Additionally, financial data, always useful. A lot of the studies out, I know the SERP data out of UCLA, they're finding that that cost is becoming an even more significant factor in enrollment than it has ever before. So if you have things like ESC for students, right? Even if they enroll, don't enroll, keep those FAFSA, keep those ICER, things so you have it. Same thing for that would be what would cost for the student to go there. One of the services we provide at College Raptor is a net price calculator, and that's because we know how important cost is on a student's probability of enrollment. So having that specific data gives us the ability to import it into models and help schools with their enrollment planning, let's say. And then there's other things that are not on this list, but things that would be great to have would be like, did the student visit campus? When did the student apply? When did the student inquire? How long were they in these pools? How far away do they live? All those kind of pieces really add into some value. Not to say that every one of the schools we work with uses those metrics, but we find that a lot of them show statistical significance. So it's better to have more variables than fewer variables. If you find a variable doesn't produce a statistical significant result, you just cut it out of the model and don't use it. But doesn't mean that maybe the next year or the year after that it wouldn't be useful. So at the same time, I also caution schools, don't over-collect data and also standardize data, right? So for example, some of the schools we work with will have 3 different metrics on GPA. They'll get what the GPA they got from the transcript, they'll get the GPA from what the student self-reported on an inquiry form, and they'll have a GPA, from what they did on their application. Let's say those 3 different places. Try to have one standard GPA, right? It makes life a lot easier trying to determine which one wins, and so try to have things that standardize and prioritize things in your system, so that you're better able to track and manage your students and build models that are consistent across years and across even students in the same year, right?
Yeah, that would probably be helpful, making sure that you have one answer rather than 3 answers, for sure.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So then, moving on to the final, our final question right now. So often we hear, again, like we're saying, like some arguments against predictive modeling. One, it's too late in the cycle that we've missed the initial inquiry by, or now we're knee deep in applications or yield, and then also maybe I don't have the tiered communication plan that other schools are using. So there's got to be other ways to use predictive modeling anywhere. I mean, yes, in the cycle, and also if you haven't built out a drip campaign, per segment, but there's got to be ways to utilize that to, again, focus your resources. Can you talk to me a little bit about those?
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of schools we work with. I mean, one of the first schools we started partnering with on predictive modeling came to us in the spring. So it was around this time of year, actually. It was mid-February, and they were seeing an abundance of applications, and they didn't really know who to focus their time on trying to get those students to yield. And so really, they came to us to say, how can we better focus our counselors' time and attention over these next 3-4 months up to May 1 to really get the most out of it. And one of the things that I thought was really telling when I looked at their data from the previous year was I found that 35% of the students who enrolled the previous year had last names A through D. And so what that told me was 2 things. So it said was, number one, that they were likely just going alphabetically because they didn't have a way of prioritizing their communication, their outreach, their calls, their time. And they were just starting at the top of the list and going A, B, C, D, right down the order. And so I think of it as like a base, going back to a baseball analogy, right? It's like a batting lineup. Whoever bats first for your team is likely to have the most at-bats in a season. So there's that. It also told me, more importantly, is that when the counselors engaged prospective students, it had a dramatic impact on a student's likelihood of enrollment. So really, the counselors were doing a great job, but they weren't focusing their efforts in the right way. And so what we did was we went in there and said, okay, instead of trying to focus your attention on all of the applicants that you have, they each had over 1,000 people to deal with, which is a lot. We said, how can we focus that to maybe 100 or 200 students? So we built a predictive model and applied the model and said, these are your top 100 or 200 kids. Of them, which ones need to complete a FAFSA? Reach out to these kids personally with calls, with texts, with personalized emails, not just these bulk things, but these individual ones that say, hey, complete your FAFSA. Hey, come to a campus visit. Hey, you haven't submitted your deposit yet, and I know you're a great fit, and I'm really excited to have you. Can you do that, right? And so they did it, and they ended up seeing a dramatic improvement. right? They went year over year. They grew their freshmen by 40%.
Wow.
I don't want to say that was all on us, but it was very helpful for them to be able to focus their time and attention on the kids that had the highest probability, as opposed to just going down the line. So, so the takeaway from this is that predictive modeling isn't something that you just use in communication flows. It certainly is a great strategy to do that, to make the most of those points. But it's any time you're focusing or engaging with prospective students, you're putting the most time and resources where it can be most effective. So the students that have the highest model scores, the highest probability of enrolling, you focus your time. Whether it's at encouraging students to do campus visits, complete FAFSAs, complete applications, get deposits in, you name it. Anywhere you can do through the enrollment process, using a model to help you focus those time and resources is the best way to maximize your enrollment probability for any given student.
And I think I remember you saying that they should once you get started you can apply that model and also rescore throughout the cycle to see how it changes depending on the data that comes in.
Absolutely, yeah. Generally speaking, when we work with a school, we try to score students about every 2 weeks. So when they have new students come into their pool, whether they're inquiries or applicants or whatever, they've got new ones. Let's score them, right? It's silly if they're not scored, then you know how to prioritize them. And then number two, as you get new data about students that are already in your pools. So let's say a student before hadn't completed a FAFSA, so we didn't know their EFC exactly. So now we do. So let's add that to the model, and that's also going to change their pricing. Or same thing for transcripts. They got a new test score come in. Any of those factors could ultimately change their enrollment probability. So as you get new data about those students, you want to keep scoring throughout the year. So I'd say every 2 weeks gives a campus generally enough time to realign their priorities for their outreach for the next little bit, their travel for the next little bit. If you could do it that quickly, that's great. As being as nimble as possible is useful. So yeah, great question. Thanks.
That's awesome. So we've actually kind of ran into the 30-minute mark, and so I'm going to open it up for a few questions, just to see if there's anything that people are, in case you sparked anything. I'll just give that a minute there for folks to go ahead and type their questions. Okay, cool. Well, we can actually something that came in, and I think this is something that I think would apply to anybody who's just getting started. I'm in a new leadership role in my office, and predictive modeling has not been an integral part of the work. Where do I begin?
Sure.
Could be a loaded question, but what would you say?
Yeah, where do you begin? Yeah, that's always a good question. Number one, I'd say modeling is useful for anybody. You being data-driven at any campus is going to help you refine your effort to maximize results while minimizing expenses and time. So I think that's useful. So what I would say to that person is look at what data you have available to you. The key is to say, what do you have from the previous year? How robust is that data? Do you have enough pieces there that are consistent for the students who enrolled, those who didn't, those that applied, those that didn't? And then sort of start looking at it in terms of, okay, what can I build out of here? If you have questions about it, I'm certainly happy to talk with you individually and say, okay, how do you go about the process? Either internally, if you can do it yourself, or if you want to partner with an outside firm or someone that has more statistical, wherewithal, certainly do so. I know a lot of campuses have resources internally. They have great people. Obviously, colleges are full of tons of smart people, right? That's why they're there. And so really, it's about maximizing your resources and looking what data do you have. Start with just looking at the year previous, and if you have 2 years or 3 years of data, that's even better. You can build a more significant model. As I like to say, I'll build a model for 1 year, and then I'll build a model for a second year, and then I'll put them together, and I'll build what I call a super model, which makes you happy. And so it's really about starting with what you have and trying to look at that, and then once you feel comfortable with that, start thinking what other pieces might be relevant to collect going forward, like campus visit, like time factors, like high school you may not have, right? Start collecting those things and see what kind of statistical elements you might have.
Gotcha. So we've got two more questions, and that's going to be all we are really going to have time for. And actually, you and I discussed this one earlier yesterday about the use of predictive modeling for K through 12 schools.
Sure.
Are you aware of anybody who's using that, or
Sure, yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I personally, I don't know of any schools that are. At the same time, that doesn't in any which way preclude the ability to do it. You certainly could build a statistical model, often a linear regression model, to predict which students are most likely to enroll or apply anywhere. You can use it at any type of business or organization. You could build models to predict that, whether it's a donations, who's most likely to donate to a church. You could even do that, right? So it's about what data points do you have about students? Do you have enough data points, historically, to look back and say, okay, which students enrolled, which didn't, to build a statistically significant model? So you would need, several hundred students would be my guess, at least as a starting point. And then once you have that, it's the same approach would apply there as it would to a college or anywhere else. It's look at the data, see which ones you can statistically analyze quantitatively, build a model, and see which factors show up as statistically significant. You could do it. The only difference between us is at College Raptor, we couldn't add some of these fun little perspective points that we have from our algorithms, but you could certainly do it with the data points you have internally. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, we have one more question, and this one, I'll just read it out. So our FA office doesn't allow us to use their data for recruitment. I assume that means financial aid.
Sure.
Against regulations. For schools like us, how do you collect EFC through the recruitment process?
Great question. That is a wonderful question.
Yeah.
Okay. So if your school is inclined to not use that, I'll tell you what we do at College Raptor here. So we have data from IRS, we have data from Census, and we have data from a few proprietary credit companies that tell us things that we work with. And so basically for any zip code in America, we have an estimate of income and wealth. We don't just have it at the zip code, we actually have it at a zip plus 4 level. So that's generally a household cluster of maybe 4 to 6 houses. And so what we do is we take the data there and say, okay, based on where that student lives, so if you have their address, we can make an estimate. And so there are certainly ways to do that. We have built a model using somewhere in the neighborhood of about 250,000 actual EFCs and locations, along with the data we have, to build a model that says, based on where a student lives, what their expected family contribution would be. And so that's what we do when we don't have a known quantity for that. Obviously, if your financial aid office doesn't want to share that, that's fine. And you don't feel like asking the student directly, or you think that would be against protocol, that's fine too. But we can certainly, throw in appended data that we can estimate based on where they live. So that's what we do internally here.
Okay, that's awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it. So we're at the end of our time, and Jeff, I want to thank you for lending your big brain on this topic that can be confusing. And honestly, I think I've talked to you 3 or 4 times about this now, and every time I learn something new. So I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. I'm very glad to be part of the call, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. Happy to have any conversations to go on further.
Yes, and I don't want to leave the webinar without plugging our next webinar. We're going to be talking about staying engaged on social media through the yield process, which should be rather interesting. And we're going to be joined by Matthew Mann, who is Assistant Director of Admissions at Averett University, and that should be another really, really interesting and fun conversation. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye and thank you. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me or Jeff, and we can be in touch and guide you through the wonderful world of predictive modeling. And so, again, thank y'all, and we will be talking soon.
Thanks a lot. Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.